The school hallway buzzed with the usual morning chatter, friends catching up, teachers preparing for their classes, and students rushing to their lockers. Among the chaos, Mr. Jacobs pushed his cart of cleaning supplies down the corridor. His hunched figure, the same navy blue janitor uniform he wore every day, and the slow, deliberate way he moved had made him a familiar, albeit often overlooked, presence at Ridgewood High. Most of the students barely noticed him. He was just the janitor, someone who mopped up messes and cleaned their classrooms without a word. But today, a group of teenagers decided to give him their attention for all the wrong reasons. "Hey, Mr. Mop," one of them called out, smirking as his friends snickered behind him. Another chimed in, "Careful, old man. Don't trip over your own mop." Their laughter echoed down the hallway as Mr. Jacobs stopped, his hands tightening around the handle of his cart. He glanced at them, his weathered face calm but tired, as if this wasn't the first time he'd been the target of their jokes. "Shouldn't you be cleaning the bathrooms or something?" one of the girls added, her voice dripping with mockery. She flipped her hair and joined the rest of the group, who were now doubling over with laughter. Mr. Jacobs didn't say a word. He simply gave a small nod, turned away, and continued on his way. To the teenagers, it was just another moment of fun, another joke at someone else's expense. But they didn't know who Mr. Jacobs really was. They didn't know the life he had lived or the stories hidden behind those quiet eyes. They didn't know that the man they mocked was once a hero. Later that afternoon, their curiosity was piqued when they saw something unusual. During a free period, they decided to follow Mr. Jacobs, sneaking behind him as he made his way to the small storage room that doubled as his break area. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, they saw something that stopped them in their tracks. On a shelf, amidst cleaning supplies and old rags, was a box. Its lid was slightly open, and inside, glinting under the dim light, were military medals. Not just any medals, these were awards of valor, bravery, and service. The kind that told stories of sacrifice and heroism. "What's all that?" one of the boys whispered, his voice no longer filled with mockery, but with confusion. Another leaned closer, trying to get a better look. Wait. Mr. Jacobs? Military? No way." The door creaked as one of them leaned against it, and Mr. Jacobs turned around, his eyes locking onto theirs. For a moment, there was silence. The group stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. But the look on Mr. Jacobs' face wasn't one of anger. It was something else, something they couldn't quite understand. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The medals gleamed on the shelf behind him, a stark contrast to the mop in his hand. The teenagers didn't answer. They didn't know how to. But what they had just seen had already planted a seed of curiosity, of doubt, and perhaps even regret. They had mocked him without knowing his story. Now, they couldn't ignore the mystery of who he really was. "And Mr. Jacobs?" He simply picked up his mop and walked out, leaving them standing there, more confused than ever. Little did they know, their lives and their perceptions were about to change forever. The group of teenagers shuffled awkwardly out of the storage room, their usual confidence replaced by an uneasy silence. None of them spoke as they made their way back down the hallway. Their laughter from earlier now, a distant memory.it, was as if the medals they'd seen had somehow stripped away the carefree bravado they usually carried. "What do you think those were for?" Ryan finally asked, breaking the silence. He was the one who had led the teasing earlier, but now his voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "Probably not real," Sarah replied quickly, though her tone lacked conviction. "I mean, why would a janitor have stuff like that?" She tossed her hair over her shoulder, trying to sound dismissive, but her eyes betrayed her curiosity. "You saw them, though," Jason said, his brow furrowed. "Those medals weren't fake. My grandpa has a couple like that, and he was in the military for years. You don't just buy those at a store." The group fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. None of them had ever stopped to think about Mr. Jacobs before. He was just there. A background figure, someone who cleaned up their messes and faded into the scenery. But now, They couldn't shake the image of those medals glinting on the shelf, or the way Mr. Jacobs had looked at them calm, steady, but with a depth they couldn't quite understand. "Maybe we should ask him," Emily suggested after a while. She was the quietest of the group, usually content to follow along with whatever the others did, but now she looked thoughtful. "I mean, if he was in the military or something, maybe he has a cool story." Ryan scoffed. "Yeah, right. Like he's just gonna sit down and tell us his life story. He probably hates us after today." "Can you blame him?" Jason muttered. "We were kind of jerks." Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Deep down, he knew Jason was right. They had been jerks. And now, for the first time, he felt a twinge of guilt. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the mystery of Mr. Jacobs lingered in the back of their minds. By the time the final bell rang, they had made a decision. Well, most of them had. They were going to try to find out more about the man they had mocked. The next day, they hung back after lunch, waiting for Mr. Jacobs to finish cleaning the cafeteria. They watched as he methodically wiped down tables and swept the floor, his movements slow but purposeful. When he finally put his supplies away and headed toward the storage room, they followed at a distance. "Mr. Jacobs?" Emily called out hesitantly as he reached for the door. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Yes." For a moment, none of them knew what to say. Then Jason stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "Ah, we wanted to say sorry. For, yesterday." Mr. Jacobs looked at them for a long moment, his gaze moving from one face to the next. Finally, he nodded. "Apology accepted." There was an awkward pause. Then Emily blurted out, "We saw your medals." Ryan shot her a look, but it was too late to backtrack now. Mr. Jacobs' expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or perhaps something deeper. "I see," he said simply. "Were you in the military?" Jason asked. Mr. Jacobs hesitated, his gaze shifting toward the storage room door. For a moment, it seemed like he might brush them off, but then he sighed and gestured for them to follow him inside. The storage room was small and cramped, with shelves lined with cleaning supplies and tools. In one corner, there was a battered chair and a small table. On the table sat the box they had seen the day before, now closed. "I don't usually talk about this," Mr. Jacobs said, his voice low. "But yes, I served in the military. A long time ago." The teenagers exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. "What branch?" Ryan asked. "The Army," Mr. Jacobs replied. "I was a sergeant in the infantry." "Were you in a war?" Sarah asked, her tone more respectful now. Mr. Jacobs nodded. "Vietnam." The room fell silent. None of them had expected that. They had learned about the Vietnam War in history class, but it had always felt like something distant, something that happened to people in textbooks, not to someone they saw every day. "What was it like?" Emily asked softly. Mr. Jacobs didn't answer right away. He looked down at the box on the table, his hand resting on the lid. "It was complicated," he said finally. "There were moments of bravery and moments of fear. Moments I'm proud of and moments I'd rather forget." The teenagers didn't know what to say. For the first time, they saw Mr. Jacobs not as a janitor, but as a person, someone who had lived a life far beyond the walls of their school. "Why don't you tell people?" Jason asked after a while. "About the medals, I mean." Mr. Jacobs gave a small, rueful smile. "Because it's not about the medals. It's about the people I served with, the ones who didn't make it home. Those medals. They're not just mine. They belong to them, too." The room was quiet again, the weight of his words settling over them. For the first time, they understood that there was more to Mr. Jacobs than they could have ever imagined. And for the first time, they felt a genuine desire to know more, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. But before they could ask anything else, the bell rang, signaling the end of their free period. Mr. Jacobs gave them a nod and opened the door, motioning for them to leave. As they walked back to class, the group was unusually quiet. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, their perceptions of Mr. Jacobs and themselves forever changed. The days that followed were different. The teenagers couldn't look at Mr. Jacobs the same way anymore. Every time they saw him in the hallway or the cafeteria, they felt a mix of curiosity and guilt. They hadn't just mocked a janitor, they had mocked a man who had lived through things they couldn't begin to imagine. But there was still so much they didn't know, and that mystery gnawed at them. Ryan, who had always been the loudest in the group, seemed the most affected. He found himself watching Mr. Jacobs from a distance, noticing things he'd never paid attention to before, the way he moved a little slower on some days, as if weighed down by invisible burdens, the way his eyes sometimes seemed far away, as though he were seeing something none of them could. Ryan didn't say anything to his friends, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. One afternoon, as the group hung out in the school courtyard, Jason brought up what they were all thinking. "Do you think he's okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Who?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Mr. Jacobs," Jason said. "I mean, he seems... I don't know. Lonely, maybe?" Emily nodded. "He's always by himself. I've never seen him talk to anyone unless it's about work." Ryan frowned, staring at the ground. "Maybe we should do something. Like, I don't know, show him we're sorry for how we treated him." "Like what? What?" Sarah asked skeptically. "Bake him cookies." "No," Ryan said, his tone serious. "But maybe we can just, I don't know, be nice to him. Show him we care." The others exchanged uncertain glances, but no one disagreed. The next day, they decided to put their plan into action. During lunch, they approached Mr. Jacobs as he cleaned a spill near the vending machines. He looked up as they neared, his expression wary but calm. "Mr. Jacobs," Ryan began, his voice unusually soft, "we were wondering if you'd like to sit with us during lunch." Mr. Jacobs straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly in suspicion. "Why?" he asked, his tone neutral. Ryan hesitated, but Emily stepped in. "Because we want to get to know you better. And because we're sorry for how we treated you before." For a moment, Mr. Jacobs said nothing. Then he gave a small nod. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I have work to do." The group exchanged disappointed looks, but they didn't press him. Instead, they decided to try a different approach. Over the next few days, they made a point of saying hello to him whenever they saw him, offering to help with small tasks, and even leaving him notes of appreciation in the storage room. Slowly, they began to notice a change. Mr. Jacobs still kept to himself, but his posture seemed a little less stooped, his movements a little less heavy. Then, one Friday afternoon, something unexpected happened. As the group was heading out of the building, they saw Mr. Jacobs standing by the flagpole, staring up at the American flag fluttering in the breeze. He seemed lost in thought, his face lined with something that looked like both pain and pride. "Mr. Jacobs?" Emily called out hesitantly. He turned, and for the first time, he smiled a small, almost imperceptible smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Hello," he said. They approached him cautiously, unsure if they were intruding. "We were just heading home," Jason said. "Are you okay?" Mr. Jacobs nodded slowly. "Just remembering," he said. "Remembering what?" Ryan asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Mr. Jacobs hesitated, then gestured toward the flag. "The men I served with," he said. "The ones who didn't come back?" The group fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Did you lose a lot of friends?" Sarah asked quietly. Mr. Jacobs nodded, his gaze distant. "Too many," he said. "And not a day goes by that I don't think about them." The teenagers didn't know what to say. For all their curiosity, they hadn't truly understood the depth of what Mr. Jacobs had experienced. "Why don't you tell people?" Emily asked after a moment. "About what you went through, I mean." Mr. Jacobs sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Because it's not about me," he said. "It's about them. Talking about it. It feels like opening a wound that never really healed." The group nodded, their their respect for him growing with every word. As they walked home that day, they couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Jacobs and the sacrifices he had made. They knew there was still so much they didn't understand, but they also knew one thing for certain: they wanted to honor him, not just with words, but with actions. What they didn't know was that their efforts to reach out to Mr. Jacobs were about to uncover a secret one that would change everything they thought they knew about him and bring them face to face with the true meaning of sacrifice and heroism. The following Monday, the group arrived at school with a new sense of purpose. They had spent the weekend brainstorming ways to honor Mr. Jacobs and show their appreciation for him. Emily had suggested organizing a small assembly to recognize his military service, but Ryan had been unsure. What if he doesn't want the attention? He had said, remembering how private Mr. Jacobs seemed about his past. Jason had proposed something simpler, a thank you card signed by students and teachers. It felt more personal, less overwhelming. They decided to start with that and see how Mr. Jacobs reacted. But as they began collecting signatures during lunch, they overheard something that stopped them in their tracks. Two teachers were chatting near the staff lounge, their voices low but just loud enough to carry. "Did you hear about Mr. Jacobs?" one of them asked. The group froze, straining to hear the conversation. "Yeah," the other teacher replied. "It's such a shame. He's such a good man, but I guess everyone has their limits." "What are you talking about?" the first teacher asked, confused. "Apparently, he's retiring at the end of the month. Something about health issues. I heard the principal talking about it this morning." The group exchanged shocked glances. Retiring? Mr. Jacobs hadn't said anything about leaving. And health issues? He had always seemed so steady, so dependable. They couldn't imagine the school without him. "We have to do something," Emily whispered urgently. "If he's leaving, we need to make sure he knows how much he means to us before he goes." But Ryan shook his head, his brow furrowed. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "Why would he retire now? He's been here forever. And he didn't say anything to us on Friday." "Maybe he didn't want to worry us," Sarah suggested. "Or maybe there's more to it," Jason added, his voice low. The group fell silent, the weight of the news settling over them. They had just started to understand Mr. Jacobs, to see him as more than the quiet janitor who kept to himself. The thought of losing him now felt like a blow. Determined to get answers, they decided to talk to him after school. But when the final bell rang and they made their way to the storage room, they found it empty. The box of medals was gone, and the shelves looked unusually bare, as though Mr. Jacobs had already begun packing up his things. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with worry. Ryan thought for a moment, then snapped his fingers. "The flagpole," he said. "Remember how he was standing there on Friday? Maybe he's there again." The group hurried outside, and sure enough, they spotted Mr. Jacobs near the flagpole, his back to them. He was holding something in his hands, and as they got closer, they saw that it was a folded American flag. "Mr. Jacobs?" Ryan called out hesitantly. He turned slowly, his expression calm but tired. "What are you kids doing out here?" he asked. "We heard," Emily began, then hesitated. "We heard you might be retiring." Mr. Jacobs' face softened, and he nodded. "That's right," he said. "It's time for me to step away." "Why?" Jason asked, unable to hide the urgency in his voice. "You've been here so long. Why now? Now?" Mr. Jacobs sighed, looking down at the flag in his hands. "Sometimes life gives you signs," he said. "And you have to listen to them. My health isn't what it used to be, and I've been feeling tired. It's time for me to focus on myself for a while." The group was quiet, unsure of how to respond. But then Ryan stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "You've done so much for this school," he said. "For all of us. We want to do something for you before you go." Mr. Jacobs raised an eyebrow. "And what would that be?" "We're still figuring it out," Emily admitted. "But we want to make sure you know how much you're appreciated." Mr. Jacobs smiled, a real, genuine smile, and for a moment, The weight on his shoulders seemed to lift. "Thank you," he said. "That means more to me than you know." As the group walked away, they felt a renewed sense of determination. But their relief was short-lived. The next morning, as they arrived at school, they were greeted by an unexpected sight. Police cars were parked near the entrance, their lights flashing. Students and teachers stood in clusters, whispering anxiously. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jason flagged down a nearby teacher, who looked pale and shaken. "There was a break-in last night," she said. "Someone stole some things from the school." "What kind of things?" Ryan asked, his heart sinking. The teacher hesitated, then lowered her voice. "They took some personal items from the janitor's storage room. And there was some vandalism near the flagpole." The group exchanged horrified looks. The storage room, the flagpole, both connected to Mr. Jacobs. "We have to find him," Emily said urgently. But when they reached the storage room, it was locked. And Mr. Jacobs was nowhere to be found. The group stood in the hallway, their minds racing. The idea that someone had targeted Mr. Jacobs' storage room and vandalized the flagpole filled them with unease. Ryan clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. "We need to find out what's going on," he said. "This isn't just random. Someone's trying to hurt him." They decided to split up. Emily and Jason headed toward the principal's office to see if they could learn more about the break-in, while Ryan and Sarah searched the school grounds for any sign of Mr. Jacobs. As they hurried through the halls, a sense of urgency hung over them, a gnawing feeling that time was running out. Emily and Jason reached the office just as the principal stepped out, speaking with a police officer. They lingered nearby, pretending to look at a bulletin board. "It doesn't make sense," the principal was saying. "Why would anyone target him? He's one of the most respected people here." The officer nodded, jotting something down in his notebook. "We'll do everything we can to recover the stolen items." "You said they were personal belongings?" "Yes," the principal replied. "Some medals and a few other keepsakes." "He's devastated." Jason and Emily exchanged a glance. The medals. Whoever had broken in had taken Mr. Jacobs' most treasured possessions. But why? Meanwhile, Ryan and Sarah were checking the outdoor areas near the school. They finally spotted Mr. Jacobs sitting on a bench by the edge of the sports field, his head bowed. As they approached, they saw that he was holding something in his hands, a small, crumpled piece of paper. "Mr. Jacobs?" Sarah said softly. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but calm. "Hello, kids," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We heard about the break-in," Ryan said, sitting down beside him. "Are you okay?" Mr. Jacobs sighed, unfolding the paper in his hands. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about what was taken. Those medals. They're not just symbols. They're memories. Each one represents someone I served with, someone who didn't make it home. Losing them feels like losing those men all over again." Sarah's heart ached at his words. "We're going to help you get them back," she said firmly. "We promise." Before Mr. Jacobs could respond, Emily and Jason came running up, breathless. "We found something out," Jason said. "The principal said the thief took your medals. Do you have any idea who would do this?" Mr. Jacobs shook his head. "I've never had enemies," he said. "Not here. But, he trailed off, his brow furrowing in thought. Ryan leaned forward. "But what?" "There was someone," Mr. Jacobs said slowly. "A man I served with. We had a falling out years ago. He blamed me for something that wasn't my fault. I never thought he'd hold on to that grudge, but maybe." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Could someone from Mr. Jacobs' past have tracked him down after all these years? Before they could discuss it further, the police officer from earlier approached. "Mr. Jacobs," he said, "we've reviewed the security footage. We'd like you to come take a look." Mr. Jacobs stood, his face a mix of hope and apprehension. "I'll be right there." The teenagers followed him to the principal's office, where the officer played the footage. The grainy video showed a shadowy figure breaking into the storage room late at night, moving with purpose. The figure's face was obscured, but something about their posture seemed familiar. "That's him," Mr. Jacobs said quietly. "That's the man I told you about." The officer nodded. "Do you know where we might find him?" Mr. Jacobs hesitated, then gave an address. "It's been years, but last I heard, he was living there." The officer thanked him and left to follow up on the lead. The group stayed behind with Mr. Jacobs, who looked both relieved and weary. "I never wanted this," he said. "I thought I'd left all that behind." A few hours later, the police returned with good news. The suspect had been found, and the medals were recovered, along with a note confessing to the crime. The man had been struggling with guilt and bitterness for years, and seeing Mr. Jacobs' name in a local news article had brought everything flooding back. In a misguided attempt to make himself feel better, he had taken the medals, hoping to hurt Mr. Jacobs as he felt hurt. When the medals were returned, Mr. Jacobs held them close, his hands trembling. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just to the police, but to you kids. You've shown me kindness I didn't expect." Ryan stepped forward, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with sincerity. "You've done so much for all of us," he said. "It's the least we could do." But just as they thought the story was over, Mr. Jacobs pulled something from his pocket, a small, folded letter. "I was going to leave this behind when I retired," he said. "But now, I think it's time you read it." The group watched as he unfolded the letter, his hands steady despite the weight of what it contained. As he began to read, they realized it wasn't just a farewell, it was a tribute. A tribute to the men he had served with, the sacrifices they had made, and the lessons they had taught him. It was a reminder that even in the quietest corners of life, there are stories of courage and resilience waiting to be heard. When he finished, the room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. And in that moment, the teenagers understood that their lives and their view of the world had been forever changed. The room remained still after Mr. Jacobs finished reading the letter. His voice had been steady, but there was a quiet strength in the words that left the group speechless. They had come to know him as the janitor, the quiet man who cleaned the halls and swept the floors. But what they hadn't realized until now was that Mr. Jacobs was more than just a janitor. He was a man who had seen things, lost things, and carried burdens that most people could never imagine. Ryan, who had always been the loudest and most outspoken, found himself at a loss for words. He had never expected to feel such a deep sense of respect for someone like Mr. Jacobs. The man they had once mocked, the man they had dismissed as just the janitor, was now someone they admired more than they had ever imagined. "We didn't know," Emily said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "We didn't know what you'd been through." Mr. Jacobs smiled gently, folding the letter back into his pocket. "I didn't expect you to. Not everyone knows what it's like to carry those kinds of memories. But that's why I never wanted to talk about it. It's easier to keep it all inside." Jason, who had been quiet up until this point, spoke up. "We're sorry, Mr. Jacobs. We were wrong about you. We shouldn't have treated you the way we did." Mr. Jacobs gave a small nod. "I understand. But you've shown me something I didn't expect. You've shown me that there's still kindness in this world, even when it seems like everything's falling apart." The group stood there for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words. They had started this journey with the intention of showing Mr. Jacobs that they appreciated him, but what they hadn't realized was that they had learned just as much from him as he had from them. They had learned about sacrifice, about humility, and about the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, not just for the roles they play in society. As the days passed, the group continued to make an effort to show Mr. Jacobs how much they valued him. They didn't just say thank you, they showed it in their actions. They helped him with his work, brought him small gifts, and made sure he knew that he wasn't alone. They didn't need to throw a grand ceremony or make a big fuss. All they needed to do was be there for him, just as he had always been there for them. The school year came to an end, and Mr. Jacobs' retirement day arrived. It was a quiet affair, with only a few close friends and colleagues gathered to wish him well. The group of teenagers Ryan, Emily, Jason, and Sarah were there, standing off to the side, watching as Mr. Jacobs said his goodbyes. He didn't want any fanfare, just a simple farewell. But there was a deep sense of gratitude in the air, and everyone who knew him could feel it. As the ceremony wrapped up, Mr. Jacobs approached the group. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I never thought I'd find friends like you at this stage in my life. You've reminded me that it's never too late to make a difference." Ryan stepped forward, his eyes a little misty. "You've made a difference in our lives, Mr. Jacobs. You've shown us what it really means to be a hero." Mr. Jacobs smiled, placing a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "You're the ones who will change the world," he said. "Just remember to always be kind, to always look beyond the surface. There's more to people than what you see." With that, Mr. Jacobs turned and walked out of the school, his steps slow but steady. The group watched him go, knowing that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The months that followed were a time of reflection for the group. They all graduated, each of them carrying the lessons they had learned from Mr. Jacobs with them. Ryan, who had once been the class clown, became more thoughtful, more aware of the people around him. Emily, who had always been the quiet observer, found herself speaking up more, standing up for those who were overlooked or ignored. Jason, who had always been a bit of a loner, began to connect with others in a way he never had before. And Sarah, who had always been the one to follow the crowd, became a leader, encouraging her friends to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy. They never saw Mr. Jacobs again after that day, but they kept in touch. Every year, they sent him a card, a small token of appreciation for the man who had changed their lives. And each year, without fail, they received a letter from him in return, full of wisdom and encouragement. Years later, long after they had all moved on to different paths in life, they found themselves back at their old school, standing near the flagpole where they had first met Mr. Jacobs. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day that made you feel nostalgic for the past. As they stood there, reminiscing about the good times and the lessons they had learned, they saw something that made them stop in their tracks. A new janitor was working by the flagpole, sweeping the ground. He was a young man, not much older than they had been when they first met Mr. Jacobs. And as they watched him, they couldn't help but notice the way he moved, the way he carried himself with quiet dignity. He wasn't just cleaning the school, he was taking pride in his work, just as Mr. Jacobs had. Ryan turned to his friends, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You think he knows?" he asked, nodding toward the janitor. Emily smiled back. "I think he will," she said. "In time." And with that, the group walked away, knowing that the legacy of Mr. Jacobs would live on, not just in the medals he had left behind, but in the way he had touched their lives and taught them to see the world through a different lens. The story of Mr. Jacobs had come full circle. It had started with a group of teenagers mocking an elderly janitor, but it had ended with them learning about the true meaning of sacrifice, honor, and friendship. And as they walked away from the school, they knew that they would never forget the man who had taught them the most important lesson of all, that every person has a story, and every story deserves to be heard.